He didn't knock, didn't warn her. Owen Mercer simply walked into her father's office, dropped a single piece of paper onto the desk, and said, "Sign it or lose everything by sundown." Savannah was 17. She watched her father's hand shake as he read the document. She watched him sign. 3 weeks later, the ranch her grandfather had bled for was gone, transferred legally, cleanly, to a man who had never once touched the soil. Nobody went to prison. Nobody even apologized. The lawyer called it a business transaction. Savannah called it what it was, theft wearing a suit. Now she was 31, and she was walking through the gate of another man's ranch, carrying the same battered suitcase she'd packed the night her family lost everything. If you were her, would you walk away again? Or would you finally fight back? Before we go any further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Stories like this one don't come around often, and you don't want to miss what happens next. Drop a like and leave a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's get into it. The morning Savannah Mercer drove through the front gate of Ironcrest Ranch, the sky was the color of old ash. Not the dramatic painted kind of gray that people in cities described when they wanted to sound poetic. Just flat, tired gray. The kind that sits over mountain country when autumn hasn't decided whether it wants to become winter yet. She had been driving since 3 in the morning, not because the drive required it, but because she couldn't sleep. She had tried. She'd lain on the thin mattress in the motel outside Crestfall for 4 hours, staring at a water stain on the ceiling that looked, if she tilted her head, like a hand reaching for something it couldn't quite touch. At 2:50, she gave up, washed her face with cold water, and got in the truck. The job listing had been specific in a way that most were not. Ironcrest Ranch, established operation in the high country, seeking experienced records manager with knowledge of land contracts, payroll systems, and ranch finance. Must be comfortable working independently, references required. The pay was better than anything else she'd found in 8 months of looking, and the location was remote enough that nobody there would know her name or her family's story. That last part mattered more than she was willing to admit out loud. She pulled the truck to a stop in front of a long, low-slung building that she assumed was the main office. The yard was wide and dusty. 3 horses stood near the far fence, utterly unbothered by her arrival. A dog she couldn't quite identify lifted its head from the dirt, considered her for exactly 2 seconds, and went back to sleep. She grabbed her suitcase, one bag, as always, because she'd learned a long time ago that carrying too much made it harder to leave when leaving became necessary, and started toward the office door. She hadn't taken 4 steps when a voice came from somewhere to her left. "You're going the wrong way." She stopped, turned. A man was crouching near the fence line, maybe 30 feet away, working on a post that had clearly seen better years. He had a hammer in one hand and wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the post, studying it the way a person studies a problem they've seen before and know they can fix, if they're just left alone to do it. "I'm looking for the main office," she said. "That's the equipment barn." He still didn't look up. "Office is the building with the blue door around the side." She looked. There was, in fact, a blue door around the side of the adjacent building. She felt briefly ridiculous, which she resented. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once, the way men out here nodded. Not unfriendly, but not exactly warm either. Just acknowledging that words had been exchanged and the transaction was complete. "You the new records person?" he asked, still not looking up. "I am." "Good luck," he said. And there was something in the way he said it. Not sarcastic, not kind, just honest, like someone commenting on weather. She wanted to ask what he meant. She didn't. She walked around to the blue door and knocked. Nobody answered for a long moment. Then the door swung open with the particular force of someone who had yanked it rather than opened it, and Savannah found herself looking at a man who seemed to have arranged his entire face into a permanent expression of disapproval. I was maybe 50, broad across the shoulders, with the kind of sun-hardened skin that came from decades outdoors. He wore his authority the same way some men wore cologne, aggressively, and in quantities that made everyone nearby uncomfortable. "Savannah Mercer," she said, because clearly no pleasantries were coming from his direction. "Owen Mercer," he said, "foreman." He looked at her suitcase, then at her, then at the suitcase again, as if confirming some private suspicion. "You're younger than I expected." "I'm 31. Like I said." He stepped back, barely enough to let her pass. We've had 3 records managers in 2 years. 2 of them quit inside a month. One lasted 6 weeks before he had some kind of episode and drove himself to the nearest town and didn't come back. She followed him down a narrow hallway. What kind of episode? The nervous kind. He said it like it was a character flaw. The records room is in the back. Nobody's touched it in 4 months. The owner wants it sorted. I want it out of my way. Those are your instructions. Who's the owner? She asked. Owen didn't answer immediately. He pushed open a door at the end of the hall and gestured inside. Absentee management. You deal with me. I deal with everything else. She stepped through the door and stopped. Whatever she had expected, and she had managed her expectations carefully, because hope was a thing she spent sparingly. It was not this. The room was large. It had probably been a functional space at some point, maybe even an organized one. But what it was now was closer to archaeological excavation site than office. Filing boxes were stacked in columns that reached the ceiling, some of them leaning at angles that defied physics. Paper spilled from open drawers like something living was trying to escape. A long table along the far wall was buried under contracts. She could see the edges of them, dozens deep, some of them water-stained, some of them looking like they'd been folded and unfolded so many times the paper had gone soft as cloth. On the floor near the window, someone had started sorting things at some point. 3 piles. She could tell because whoever had started it had given up after the first pile and a half, leaving a trail of documents scattered between the intention and the failure. Savannah set her suitcase down just inside the door. Owen was watching her from the doorway. She got the distinct impression he was waiting for her to make some comment that would give him a reason to be contemptuous. She didn't give him one. I'll need a list of the filing system that was in use before this, she said, if there was one. Can't help you there. I'll also need access to the bank account records, the payroll registers going back at least 3 years, and copies of any land contracts that were active in the last 5 years. Something shifted in Owen's expression. It was subtle, a brief tightening around the eyes, a slight recalibration that he covered quickly with his usual dismissive manner. You'll get what you need when I decide you need it. The owner contracted me to restore these records, she said, keeping her voice level. That means I'll need access to the underlying documents, bank records, payrolls, land contracts. If there's a reason that's a problem, I'd like to know now rather than after I've spent 2 weeks working around it. The silence between them lasted about 5 seconds longer than was comfortable. Get yourself settled first, Owen said finally. Bunkhouse assignment is on the board by the kitchen. Dinner is at 6. Don't be late. Cook doesn't hold plates. He pulled the door partially closed and then stopped. And Miss Mercer, this is a working ranch. Whatever you think a records manager does, out here, you stay in your lane. You deal with paper. You leave everything else alone. He left. Savannah stood in the ruined room for a long moment. She could still hear his boots on the floor of the hallway, each step deliberate and heavy, the footstep of a man who was accustomed to rooms rearranging themselves around his presence. She turned back to the mess. Something was wrong here. She'd felt it the moment she walked in, but now, standing in it, the feeling sharpened into something more specific. This wasn't neglect. She'd seen neglect. Her own family's books had been neglected for years. The ordinary chaos of people too busy working to organize the paperwork behind the work. This was different. She picked up the nearest contract from the table. It was a land transfer document dated about 3 years prior. She read it once, then again. The legal language was standard. She knew land contract language the way some people knew scripture, because she'd spent years afterward reading the documents that had cost her family their home, trying to understand exactly how it had been done to them. But the signatures didn't match what she'd expect for the dates listed. The notary stamp was from a county office 300 miles away, which made no sense for a local land transfer. She set it down carefully. She picked up another, and another. By the 4th document, her hands had gone very still, and her breathing had slowed in the way it did when her mind was working faster than she wanted to show on the outside. She had seen this before. Not this specific arrangement, not this precise geography, but the shape of it, the beautiful, terrible geometry of fraud. A notary here that shouldn't be here. A signature there that didn't quite line up with the letterhead. Documents that looked right until you knew what right was supposed to look like, and then they looked like something else entirely. She put the 4th document down on the table, very carefully, in a different spot from where she'd found it. She was going to need a lot more time in this room. She was going to need to be very, very careful about who she talked to. She picked up her suitcase and went to find the bunkhouse. She didn't sleep well that first night either, but that wasn't unusual for her in new places. She lay on a cot that was more functional than comfortable, listening to the sounds of a working ranch settling into darkness, horses moving in the far pasture, the occasional voice of a ranch hand somewhere across the yard, a door closing. She was thinking about the notary stamps. She was thinking about the foreman's eyes when she'd asked for the land contracts. She was also thinking about the man at the fence post, the quiet one who'd told her where the blue door was. Not romantically. Not the way women in certain kinds of stories started thinking about quiet men with hammers. She was thinking about him pragmatically, which was how she thought about most things. He clearly knew the ranch, had clearly been there a while, and he'd called her the new records person without any of the condescension Owen had offered. He'd also said good luck in that particular way. Honest. Like someone who meant it. Like someone who knew she was going to need it. At 5:15, she got up, dressed in the dark, and went back to the records room. She worked for 3 hours before anyone else stirred. She didn't organize, not yet. She read. She read contracts and payroll sheets and invoices with the systematic focus of someone who had been trained in exactly this kind of document forensics, because she had been, not formally, not from any school, but from the years she'd spent after losing her family's ranch trying to understand in precise and legal terms exactly how it had happened. By 8 o'clock, when the ranch outside was fully awake and moving, she had found 6 anomalies. 6 things that didn't fit. 6 places where the paper didn't match the reality it was supposed to represent. Each one, alone, was explainable. Records got mixed up, clerks made errors, dates got transposed. But 6 things, all bending in the same direction, that wasn't error. She was standing with a payroll register in her hands when the door to the records room opened without a knock, and Owen Mercer filled the frame. "You're here early," he said. Couldn't sleep. His eyes went to the documents she'd rearranged on the table. "I said don't touch the land contracts until I've had a chance to review what's there." "You said I'd get access when you decided I needed it," she said. "You didn't say not to touch what was already out." His jaw shifted. "That's not what I meant." "Then I misunderstood," she said, with exactly enough deference to be technically acceptable and exactly enough steadiness to make clear it wasn't submission. "I'll wait on the additional I've been working on the payroll registers. Those are clearly mine to sort." He looked at the registers, then at her. "What have you found?" "Inconsistencies in the dating system. Whoever was maintaining these wasn't using the same format month to month. It makes reconciliation harder. I'll need to standardize before I can give you clean totals." That was true. It was also not the whole truth. Owen looked at her for 3 full seconds. Then he nodded, once, and left. Savannah waited until she heard his boots reach the far end of the hallway. Then she picked up the payroll register she'd set face down when the door opened, turned it back over, and looked again at the column of names on page 7. 14 ranch hands. All listed, all apparently paid. Except the total wages column, when she added it up, was 43% less than what the total should have been for 14 people at the rates listed on the rate sheet stapled to the inside cover. Someone had been paying 14 workers the wages of 8. The other 6 workers' wages had gone somewhere. She just didn't know where yet. She wrote nothing down. She never wrote things down in places where documents could be found. She committed the number to memory, 43%, and put the register back where she'd found it, at the same angle, with the same slight dog ear on the upper right corner that had been there before she touched it. Then she went to breakfast and ate oatmeal and said almost nothing, and watched the ranch hands who came in and out of the kitchen and wondered which of them knew they were being robbed. It was 2 days before she saw the quiet cowboy again. He came into the kitchen just as she was leaving, and he was carrying a length of wire and a pair of pliers, the way other people carried briefcases, like they were simply an extension of whatever work his hands were always doing. He nodded at her. She nodded back. "How's the paper situation?" he asked. No mockery in it. Genuine question. "Complicated," she said. He considered that. Usually is this time of year. She wasn't sure what time of year had to do with paper, but she got the impression he wasn't really talking about paper either. She studied him for a moment, not long enough to be obvious, just long enough to file. He was maybe mid-30s, lean in the way that came from actual work and not from a gym. There was something deliberate about the way he stood, the way he held still when he wasn't moving. Most ranch hands had a kind of ambient restlessness. This one didn't. He stood like a man who had decided exactly where he wanted to be and had no need to prove it. "Luke," she said. "Right? That's what you told me at the fence." "That's right." "How long have you been at Ironcrest?" Something passed across his face. Not guilt exactly. Not quite. More like the expression of someone who was answering a question they were choosing, very carefully, how much of the truth to include. "About a year," he said, "give or take." "You know the operation well?" "Well enough." "And Owen Mercer?" The pliers shifted slightly in his hand. "Owen runs things his way." "What does that mean?" "Means he's been foreman a long time," Luke said. "Means people around here learn not to ask certain questions." She waited. He didn't add anything else. "What kind of questions?" she asked. He looked at her directly for the first time since the conversation had started. His eyes were an unremarkable shade of brown, but they were paying very close attention. "The kind that make a person feel the need to start early in the morning and eat breakfast alone," he said. The kitchen went quiet between them for a moment. Outside, someone called across the yard and a horse responded. Savannah picked up her coffee cup. "Good talk," she said. The edge of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. "Be careful," he said. Same tone as before. Same honest, unadorned simplicity. Not dramatic. Just a statement of what he believed to be true. She walked out of the kitchen and didn't look back, because looking back was a habit she'd spent years breaking. But she thought about what he'd said for the rest of the afternoon, sitting cross-legged on the floor of the records room, working through contracts that were beginning to form a pattern so clear and so criminal that her hands had started to shake. Not with fear, with fury. She recognized this. She had lived inside this exact architecture of theft before, seen it from the victim's side, watched it take everything her family had built over 3 generations and convert it into a signature on a page that meant someone else owned it now. She was not going to stand by this time. She was not going to be 17 and helpless this time. She picked up the next contract, spread it flat, and got back to work. By the time darkness came down over the mountain and the ranch went quiet, she had found evidence of 3 shell companies, 2 fraudulent land transfers, and payroll records that, if she was reading them correctly, showed systematic wage theft running back at least 4 years. She sat very still in the middle of it all. Somewhere out in the yard, she heard boots on gravel. She recognized the rhythm of them, not Owen's deliberate, heavy stride. Something quieter, more patient. Luke heading somewhere in the dark. She wondered, not for the first time, exactly what he already knew, and why he was still here if he knew it. She turned back to the documents. The answer was in here somewhere. It always was. Paper didn't lie the way people did. Paper told the truth, whether it meant to or not, and she had gotten very good at listening. The shaking in her hands was gone by morning. That was the thing about fury. It had a shelf life. It burned hot for a while, and then it either consumed you or it converted into something steadier, something colder. Savannah had learned, over the years, to convert it. She was back in the records room before the sun was fully up, which meant she'd been working for going on 5 hours by the time the ranch sounds outside started telling her that the rest of the world was waking up. Boots on gravel. The low complaint of cattle somewhere distant. The particular metallic clank of the water pump near the barn that went off like a reluctant alarm clock every single morning at exactly 6:47. No matter what. She had pulled the payroll registers for all 4 years she could find and laid them out in chronological order across the floor because the table wasn't big enough, and the floor was honest. Documents on the floor couldn't pretend to be something they weren't. They just lay there and told you what they were. What they were was a mess, but not the random kind. The random kind had a certain texture to it. You could feel it when you were sorting through genuine disorder, the way things accumulate when busy people are just trying to get through their days. Papers filed wrong, numbers transposed, dates that didn't line up because someone was tired or distracted. This was different. This had been arranged to look random. Someone had put genuine effort into creating the appearance of ordinary chaos, which, when you knew what to look for, was its own kind of signature. She was on her knees between the 2019 and 2020 registers when she found the first payroll ghost. His name was listed as R. Calloway. Ranch hand, general labor, paid bi-weekly. He appeared in the register from March through October of 2019. 8 months of wages, totaling close to $4,000 at the listed rate. Except his name appeared nowhere else. Not in the bunkhouse assignment records she'd found in a side drawer. Not in the work logs. Not in the equipment checkout sheets that she'd begun cross-referencing the night before. R. Calloway had apparently shown up for work every 2 weeks for 8 months, collected his wages, and left absolutely no other trace of his existence on this ranch. She sat back on her heels and stared at the name. Then she started looking for others. By 9 o'clock, she had found 4 more. 5 ghost workers across 4 years of payroll, names that appeared regularly enough to seem real, collected wages consistently enough to seem employed, and existed nowhere else in the physical record of the ranch's daily operation. Someone was writing paychecks to people who didn't exist. Or rather, someone was writing the records of paychecks to people who didn't exist, keeping the wages for themselves, and burying the names in enough real paperwork that a casual auditor would never look twice. This was not a foreman skimming small amounts. The total, when she ran the numbers in her head twice to make sure, was close to $60,000 across 4 years. $60,000 that had been labeled as wages and had gone somewhere that wasn't any real person's pocket. She stood up, rolled her neck until it cracked in 3 places, and walked to the window. Outside, Owen Mercer was crossing the yard with 2 of the ranch hands. He was talking, gesturing toward the north pasture fence line, and the 2 hands were nodding with the practiced attentiveness of men who had learned that inattention had costs. He looked exactly like what he appeared to be, a tough, competent foreman running a large operation with the confidence of long tenure. He also looked like a man who had been stealing from this ranch for at least 4 years and had gotten very comfortable with it. She needed more than payroll ghosts. Payroll fraud was damaging, but it was also the kind of thing that defense lawyers could explain away. Clerical error, poor record keeping, former employee who left without formal documentation. She needed the land contracts. She needed to know where those shell companies connected, what they owned, and whether the fraudulent land transfers were still active. Owen had told her to wait. She had been waiting 4 days. She looked at the filing cabinet in the far corner that she hadn't opened yet because the key was missing and she hadn't wanted to force it before she knew more about who was watching her work. She crossed the room, crouched in front of the cabinet, and looked at the lock. It was a standard filing cabinet lock, the kind that had been standard for about 40 years and that anyone with the right piece of bent wire could open in under a minute. She didn't have bent wire. She had a letter opener with a thin, flat end. It took her 90 seconds. The cabinet had 3 drawers. The top one held more payroll records, duplicates, apparently, of things she'd already seen. The middle one held what looked like correspondence, and she filed that away for later. The bottom drawer held a single folder, thick and rubber-banded, with no label on the tab. She took it out, sat cross-legged on the floor, and opened it. The first document inside was a land transfer agreement dated 18 months ago. The transferring party was Ironcrest Ranch, LLC. The receiving party was a company called Ridgeline Consolidated Holdings. She had never heard of Ridgeline Consolidated Holdings. She kept reading. The transfer covered 412 acres in the northwestern section of the ranch property, land that, based on the map notation in the corner of the document, ran along the main ridge above the valley. The stated price was significantly below market value, but not so far below that it would automatically trigger scrutiny. Just enough below that someone who knew land values in this territory would notice. She set that document aside and picked up the next. Another transfer. Different parcel. Same receiving company. Ridgeline Consolidated Holdings. Different date. 8 months before the first one she'd read. This one covered 370 acres on the eastern boundary. She kept going. By the time she reached the bottom of the folder, she was looking at 6 separate land transfers over a period of 3 years. All from Ironcrest Ranch to Ridgeline Consolidated Holdings, totaling just under 2,000 acres. 2,000 acres. Quietly moved, in pieces, to a company she'd never heard of. She turned back to the first transfer and looked more carefully at the signatures. The transferring party, Ironcrest Ranch, LLC, was signed by the managing member. The signature was illegible in the practiced way that legal signatures became illegible, a stylized loop and slash that could be read as almost anything, except for one detail. The printed name beneath the signature, which was standard on legal documents, read, L. Ashford, Managing Member. She read it again, L. Ashford, not Owen Mercer, not any other name she'd encountered in the records room. An owner, an actual owner, signing land transfers. She went through all 6 documents. All 6 had the same signature. All 6 named L. Ashford as the managing member of Ironcrest Ranch, LLC. An absentee owner, Owen had said. You deal with me. She thought about what that meant if L. Ashford had signed 6 land transfers moving 2,000 acres off the ranch. Either the owner had authorized the transfers and was complicit, or the owner's signature had been forged, which was a different kind of crime entirely. Either way, she needed to know who L. Ashford was. She thought about the payroll registers on the floor. She thought about 5 ghost workers and $60,000. She thought about Ridgeline Consolidated Holdings and 6 land transfers and a foreman who had told her to stay in her lane and leave everything else alone. Then she thought about R. Calloway, who had never existed, and the $4,000 that had been paid in his name to some pocket she couldn't yet see. She put the folder back exactly as she'd found it, rubber band and all, and locked the cabinet back with the letter opener. Then she went to lunch and ate without tasting it, and came back and sat down with the middle drawer correspondence, which she hadn't looked at yet. She was 3 letters in when she found the document that made her set everything down and just breathe for a minute. It was a letter from a law firm, Holloway and Associates, offices in the territorial capital, addressed to Owen Mercer directly. The date was 6 weeks ago. The language was careful and professional and said, essentially, that the timeline for the final phase of consolidation had been moved up, that the remaining parcels needed to be transferred before the end of the next quarter, that any documentation which might complicate the transfer process should be reviewed and handled appropriately before then. Any documentation which might complicate the transfer process should be reviewed and handled appropriately. She read that sentence 4 times. Handled appropriately. She knew what that meant. She had seen what that meant 14 years ago, when certain documents from her family's ranch had simply ceased to exist between the time they should have been filed and the time anyone thought to look for them. They were going to destroy the records. That was why nobody had touched this room in 4 months. They were waiting, either for the right moment, or the right instruction, or the right person to tell them the coast was clear. She had been hired to sort the records, and the records were what they needed to make disappear. She sat with that for a moment. Then she stood up, walked out of the records room, through the hallway, out the blue door, and into the cold afternoon air. She needed to move. When she stood still with information like this, it had a tendency to compress into panic, and panic was useless to her. She walked to the far fence line and stood there looking at the north pasture. The mountains were sharp against the sky up here. Not the soft, rolling kind, but the actual hard-edged kind, like something had torn the sky and the rock was showing through. "You don't look like someone who just did bookkeeping," said a voice behind her. She turned. Luke was there, 20 feet away, coming from the direction of the equipment barn. He'd stopped when he saw her, and he was reading her face with the same careful attention he'd given to the fence post that first morning. "I found some things," she said. She hadn't planned to say anything. The words came out anyway. "In the records room." "Yes." He came and stood beside her at the fence. Not close, but close enough to have a conversation without raising voices. He looked at the mountains rather than at her. "How bad?" "Bad enough that I'm standing out here instead of in there." He was quiet for a moment. "There's a letter from a firm called Holloway and Associates," she said. "Tells Owen to handle documentation that might cause complications within the next quarter." She felt rather than saw the slight change in him when she said the name. It was small, a fractional stillness that passed through his shoulders and then was gone. But she caught it. "You know that name," she said. "I've heard it." "In what context?" He turned and looked at her directly, the way he had in the kitchen, like he was making a decision about how much of the truth was hers to have right now. "What are you planning to do with what you found?" he asked. "That depends on what else is in there, and whether I can get to it before someone decides to handle it appropriately." He held her gaze for another moment. Then he looked back at the mountains. "The shell company that's been receiving the land transfers," he said. "Ridgeline Consolidated. You found that." It wasn't a question. She felt something cold move through her chest. "How do you know about Ridgeline?" she asked. The silence that followed was the longest one he'd given her yet. Not the silence of someone avoiding a question. The silence of someone who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and was deciding whether to set it down. "Because I've been documenting it," he said, "for about a year." The cold thing in her chest moved again, differently. "You're a ranch hand who's been documenting a shell company's land acquisition scheme." "I'm not exactly a ranch hand." She turned fully toward him. "Then what are you?" He looked at her, and something in his face shifted into something more careful and more tired than anything she'd seen from him before. My name is Luke Ashford, he said. I own Iron Crest Ranch. The wind came down off the mountain and moved through the dry grass between them. Somewhere in the far pasture, one of the horses made a sound. A door banged somewhere in the ranch yard. Savannah stood very still. L. Ashford, she said, managing member. Yes. Your signature is on 6 land transfers. I know. Did you sign them? No, he said. And the way he said it, flat and definite, no performance in it, she believed him. 2 of them were signed in my name before I understood what was happening. The other 4 were forged after I started living out here under a different identity to figure out the scope of it. She turned back to the mountains because she needed something to look at. That wasn't his face while she reordered everything she thought she knew about the last 4 days. You've been here a year, she said. Yes. Living as a ranch hand. Yes. To document what Owen and whoever is behind this were doing. Holloway, he said. Vincent Holloway. The law firm isn't just a law firm. It's the front of the operation. He's been doing this across multiple ranches in this territory for years. Iron Crest is one piece. A significant piece because of the land it controls along the ridge, but one piece. The ridge land, she said, and she thought of the map notations in the corner of the transfer documents. The ridge is worth something specific. The Railroad Commission has been looking at a route through this territory. The ridge above Iron Crest runs the most efficient corridor for about 40 miles. Whoever controls that land controls whether the railroad comes through and which properties get connected to it. It's worth... He stopped. How much? Conservatively, 3 to 4 times the current assessed value of everything on that ridge combined. Over time, probably more. She absorbed that. And the payroll fraud, the ghost workers. That's Owen covering his own take from the operation. Probably. I haven't been able to get into the payroll records. I have, she said. 5 ghost employees across 4 years, close to $60,000 in wages to people who never worked here. He was quiet again. Not surprised, she got the feeling he'd suspected as much. But something in him recalibrated around the confirmation of it. Can you document it? I already can document most of it. I need the complete land contract chain to make the transfer fraud airtight, and I need to trace Ridgeline back to Holloway, which I can't do from here. I have documentation on the Ridgeline connection, he said. I've been building a file for the last 8 months. Cross-reference business registrations, correspondence I was able to photograph, financial records from the Capitol. She looked at him. You have all of that, and you haven't gone to the authorities. I've been waiting, he said, until it was complete enough that it couldn't be dismissed or buried. Holloway has relationships with people in the county administration. Any incomplete case goes to the right desk and disappears. She thought about the letter. You have maybe weeks, she said. That correspondence from his firm. They're accelerating the timeline. They're going to destroy what's in this room. He nodded slowly. I know. That's why the records management position was advertised. I needed someone who could process what's in there faster than I could on my own. That landed differently than anything else he'd said. She looked at him for a long moment. You advertised the position. Yes. You hired me. Yes. Knowing what was in that room, knowing what was in there needed someone who understood land fraud from the inside. Your background, what happened to your family's property. I won't pretend I didn't look into your history before I offered you the job. The anger that came up in her wasn't the hot, fast kind. It was the slow kind. The kind that moved through her like cold water and settled somewhere deep. You used my family's history to recruit me into an investigation without telling me what I was walking into. He didn't flinch from that. Yes. That's not different from what Holloway does, using people without their consent for your own ends. I know, he said. And he said it the way people said things when they meant them and had already spent time sitting with the weight of them. I can't make that right by explaining why I did it. I'm telling you now because we're out of time, and because what you found this morning is more than I've been able to build on my own, and because those workers... He stopped, turned back to the pasture. Those workers have been robbed for years. Their wages, their security, their futures. Whatever you think of how I handled this, they're still the ones paying for it. The silence stretched out between them. She was furious. She was also, underneath the fury, clear. The clarity was the same thing she'd felt 4 days ago in that records room when the shape of the fraud had first declared itself to her. That specific cold certainty that said, you see this. You know what it is. You know what to do about it. How many workers? She asked. On this ranch alone? 22. Across the other ranches, Holloway has been targeting, probably 3 times that, she breathed. And if we go to the Territorial Land Office with what we have, if we go to Rowan's office with a complete documented case, it's too large to suppress. Judge Nathaniel Rowan has been the one consistent counter to Holloway's courthouse connections. A case that goes directly to Rowan with sufficient documentation to require an emergency land freeze. That's the only path that works. How far is the land office? 3 days by the mountain trails. 2 if we move fast. What happens if we try the road? Owen has people watching the main road. He doesn't know what I know. But he knows what's in that room, and he knows the timeline is running short. If he sees anyone leaving with documentation, he'll intercept. She thought about that. 3 days on mountain trails. Documentation she'd barely begun to organize. A man she'd known for less than a week standing in a field telling her he owned this ranch and had used her history as a recruitment tool. You should have told me from the start, she said. I know. If we're doing this together, there are no more strategic omissions. I find something, I tell you. You know something, you tell me. If that's not the arrangement, I walk. Agreed, he said. No hesitation. She looked at him for another moment, then she turned back toward the buildings. I need at least a week in that room. Maybe 10 days to build a complete enough record. You have the 10 days. After that, based on that letter, the risk goes up significantly. She started walking back. He fell into step beside her, not quite level, the way people walked when they weren't sure yet whether they were walking together or just going the same direction. The ghost employees, she said, are Calloway. There are 4 others. I'll need you to tell me what you know about Owen's outside accounts, if you have any information on that. I have 2 account numbers. I couldn't trace them further. Give them to me tonight. All right. And Luke. She stopped and looked at him directly. If you've known about the payroll fraud and the land transfers, and you've been here a year watching it happen while those workers got robbed, I understand why. Strategically, I understand the calculation, but I want you to understand something. He waited. Those 22 people didn't have the luxury of a strategic calculation. They just needed someone to notice faster. He held her gaze. I know, he said, for the 3rd time. And for the 3rd time she believed that he meant it, which didn't make it better, but made him a different kind of person than she'd feared for approximately 30 seconds when she'd understood what he'd done. They went back to the ranch separately, 5 minutes apart, because whatever came next required that Owen not know anything had changed between them. That night, after the bunkhouse went quiet and the ranch settled into its nighttime sounds, Savannah sat in the records room with a lantern she'd found in the supply closet and 2 account numbers written on a slip of paper in Luke's careful, economical handwriting. She cross-referenced them against every financial document she could find that had a bank routing code attached to it. She found the first match at 11:15, the second at 12:40. Both accounts received deposits that corresponded, within acceptable rounding error, to the wages of the ghost employees. Both accounts were registered to a business entity called CR Management Services, which was registered in a different county entirely. CR Management. She turned that over. Owen Ray Mercer, ORM, CR. Close enough to be intentional, not close enough to be obvious. She wrote nothing down. She kept it in her head, where it was safe, and added it to the architecture she was building. The careful, meticulous structure of evidence that would need to be airtight before it could withstand what it was going to face when they finally put it in front of a judge. She was still sitting there at 2 in the morning when she heard something outside the records room window that made her go very still. Voices. Low, close, coming from the narrow passage between the office building and the equipment barn. She turned the lantern down to almost nothing and moved toward the window without touching it. Owen's voice. And another voice she didn't recognize. End of the month at the latest. Holloway's not waiting anymore. The transfers aren't all filed yet. They'll be filed. That's Holloway's problem. Our problem is what's in that office. Owen's voice dropped lower. She pressed closer to the wall and concentrated. The new one. Records manager. She find anything? She's asking for land contracts, payroll access, wants bank records. A pause. You give them to her? Not yet, but I can't keep her away from them without making it obvious. She's sharper than she looks. So let Holloway know. I'm telling you right now, you tell Holloway. He's going to say handle it. I know what he's going to say. Owen's voice went flat in a way that made the back of Savannah's neck tighten. I just want it on record that I flagged it. Whatever happens with her is on him. Whatever happens with her is on him. She stood very still against the wall in the near dark, while the voices moved away and then disappeared. Her heartbeat was steady. She'd trained it to be steady years ago, in a different office, listening to a different man say something cold about her family. She turned the lantern back up just enough to see by. She had 7 days, maybe less. She had payroll fraud, ghost employees, shell company transfers, forged signatures, and a direct link between the foreman and a law firm that was explicitly directing the destruction of records. She needed more. She needed it faster. And she needed to make sure that Luke Ashford, whoever he really was going to hold up under what was coming. Because she'd stopped one man from being the only person she trusted a long time ago, and she wasn't entirely sure she'd stopped doing that in the last few hours, just because it was strategically inconvenient. She picked up the next set of documents, pulled the lantern a little closer, and kept working. Outside, the mountain sat quiet and enormous against the dark sky, indifferent to everything happening at its base. The wind moved through the dry grass. The horses shifted in the pasture. Somewhere on the other side of the bunkhouse, she imagined Luke Ashford was lying awake with the same specific, sleepless weight that came from knowing the full shape of a problem and knowing that knowing it was not yet enough. She understood that weight exactly. She turned the page. She gave herself exactly 48 hours after that night to keep her behavior exactly the same. Same arrival time at the records room. Same breakfast, same table, same amount of words exchanged with the people around her, which was not many. She asked Owen for the payroll access she'd requested earlier in the week, and he told her he was still reviewing what she could have, and she nodded and said she understood and went back to the documents she already had. She did not look at Luke any differently in the mornings when their paths crossed. She did not seek him out. She let 2 full days pass in which everything on the surface of Ironcrest Ranch looked exactly as it had before she'd heard Owen Mercer say, "Whatever happens with her is on him," through a darkened window. On the 3rd morning, she left a folded piece of paper under a specific loose board in the equipment barn that Luke had shown her, the one near the 2nd stall post, because they had agreed they needed a method of communication that left nothing visible, and this was the best option they had. The paper said, "I need everything you have, all of it, tonight." That evening, after the ranch went quiet, he slid a manila envelope under the door of the records room. No knock, no conversation. Just the envelope, thick with contents, appearing in the gap between the door bottom and the floor like it had decided to arrive on its own. She took it to the lantern and opened it. What Luke Ashford had spent a year collecting was meticulous in a way that surprised her, and she told herself afterward that it shouldn't have. He'd been living this investigation for 12 months, and whatever else she thought about his methods, he was clearly not careless. There were photographs of correspondence she hadn't seen. There were copies of business registration documents for Ridgeline Consolidated Holdings that showed its registered agent as a law clerk employed by Holloway and Associates. There were handwritten notes, his handwriting, small and precise, cross-referencing dates of land transfers with dates of specific correspondence, building a timeline that showed the transfers hadn't been opportunistic but planned, sequenced, coordinated across multiple properties over a period of years. And there was a map. She almost missed it because it was folded inside a sheaf of business registration copies, and it looked at first like a standard land survey. But when she unfolded it fully and held it close to the lantern, she understood what she was looking at. It was a Railroad Commission survey. Preliminary routing study for a proposed line through the Northern Territory. The survey date was 18 months ago. Along one edge, someone, not Luke's handwriting, someone else's, had penciled notations indicating which parcels fell within the proposed right-of-way corridor. Every piece of land that Ridgeline Consolidated Holdings had acquired from Ironcrest Ranch over the past 3 years fell within that corridor. Every single piece. She sat down on the floor of the records room with the map in her lap and just looked at it for a while, because the scale of it, when it became fully visible, had a kind of weight that required a moment. This wasn't a foreman skimming wages and a lawyer helping move some land at below-market prices. This was a coordinated, multi-year scheme to position a single entity to control the most valuable corridor of undeveloped land in the territory at exactly the moment when that corridor would become worth more than anyone had publicly acknowledged. Vincent Holloway wasn't stealing a ranch. He was stealing a railroad, or rather, he was stealing the land that whoever owned it when the Railroad Commission made its final decision would use to extract extraordinary value from the railroad for decades. Freight rates, access fees, development rights along the corridor. The numbers involved, projected forward even conservatively, were not in the hundreds of thousands. They were in the millions. And the families who had actually built and worked this land, who had bled for it in the literal sense, whose calloused hands and tired backs had made it worth anything at all, were going to get nothing. She put the map carefully to one side and kept reading through Luke's materials until the lantern oil started running low. By the time she stopped, just past 3 in the morning, she had a complete picture. Not a perfect one. There were still gaps in the documentary chain, places where she could see the shape of the crime but couldn't yet prove the specific mechanism. But it was the most complete picture anyone had assembled of what Vincent Holloway was doing in this territory. Between her work in the records room and Luke's year of documentation, they had something. Whether it was enough was a different question. She put everything back in the envelope, tucked it under a loose floorboard in the back corner of the records room that she'd identified on her 3rd day as a place where no one else seemed to look, and went to bed. She didn't sleep. She lay on the cot running the gaps in sequence, the way she'd learned to do years ago, not dwelling on what she had, but mapping what she still needed. The payroll fraud was solid. The ghost employees were documented. The land transfers were on paper. The connection between Ridgeline and Holloway's firm was traceable through the registered agent. The railroad map was circumstantial but devastating in context. What she needed was the mechanism. She needed something that showed not just that transfers had happened and that the receiving company was connected to Holloway, but that the transfers had been authorized through fraud, forged signatures, fabricated consent, legal documents manufactured to look legitimate. She had the forged signature question on the land transfers, but she needed evidence of how the forgeries had been executed, who had done it, on whose instruction. That lived somewhere in the correspondence files she hadn't fully processed yet. She was back in the records room by 5. She was still there at 7:30 when the door opened without a knock for the 2nd time that week, and this time it wasn't Owen. It was a ranch hand named Del Whitmore, who she'd seen at meals but never spoken to directly. He was somewhere in his late 40s, with the careful posture of a man who had spent years making himself smaller in rooms where he wasn't sure he was welcome. He stood in the doorway holding his hat, which told her he was uncomfortable and knew it. "Miss Mercer," he said. "Dell." She set down what she was reading but didn't put it away. She'd learned that putting things away too quickly made people who were already uncertain more uncertain. "I heard you're going through the payroll records," he said. "I am." He looked at the floor, then at the wall, then at her, which clearly took some effort. "There's been something wrong with my pay for about 8 months. I brought it to Owen twice. He told me I was miscounting." She kept her face neutral. "What kind of wrong?" "Short. Every check, about $11 short. Doesn't sound like much except—" He stopped. "Except it's your money, and you counted it right," she said. He looked at her with the expression of someone who hadn't expected to be agreed with. "Yes, ma'am. I know what I'm owed." "You're not the only one," she said carefully. "I can't tell you details of what I've found yet, but I want you to know that what you're describing is consistent with what I'm seeing in these records." He was quiet for a moment. "Is it going to get fixed?" "That's what I'm working on." He nodded slowly, put his hat back on, started to leave, then stopped. "There's a few of the other hands who've had the same trouble. Martinez, Eddie Coles, the Perkins brothers. All of them talked to Owen. All got told they were wrong." He paused. "I'm telling you because Luke said you were someone worth talking to." She kept her expression the same. "Luke said that. Yesterday. Didn't make a big thing of it. Just said if any of us had concerns about pay records, you were the right person." He shrugged, in the way men shrugged when they were doing something that required more courage than it looked like. Figured that was worth knowing. He left. Savannah stood in the middle of the records room for a moment after the door closed, recalibrating. Luke had started quietly preparing the workers, which meant he believed the timeline was shorter than 10 days, which meant something had changed that she didn't know about yet. She left the records room, walked directly to the equipment barn, and left a second note under the loose board. It said, "What do you know that you haven't told me?" The response was there 2 hours later when she checked. It said, "Tonight, East Fence, midnight." She burned both notes in the lantern. The East Fence was a 20-minute walk from the bunkhouse, far enough from the main buildings that voices didn't carry. She got there at 5 to midnight, and Luke was already there, standing with his back against a post, looking at the mountains the way he did when he was thinking through something difficult. "Talk," she said. "Owen got a wire yesterday," he said. "I wasn't meant to see it. It came through the main office, and the clerk who took it left it on the desk for about 3 minutes before Owen got back. I read it." "What did it say?" "Holloway is coming here, in person, 4 days from now." The night air was cold enough that her breath showed. "Why?" "The wire didn't say explicitly, but the context," he paused. "Holloway doesn't make personal visits. He sends letters. He sends intermediaries. He uses his clerks and his lawyers. He's been running this operation at arm's length for years specifically, so there's no direct connection between him and any of these ranches. If he's coming here in person, it means something is wrong with the plan, and he needs to fix it himself. Or it means they're closing out the operation," she said. "If the final transfers are nearly complete, maybe he comes to ensure the last pieces are in place and the records are handled before anyone looks too closely." "That's what I think," Luke said, "which means we have 4 days, not 10. She thought about this correspondence files she hadn't finished, the mechanism evidence she still needed. 4 days was not enough, not to do it properly. The evidence isn't complete yet. If we go to Rowan's office with what we have now, there are gaps a defense lawyer could drive a freight wagon through." "I know. So we can't go now. We also can't wait until after Holloway arrives. Once he's here, everything in that room is at risk." They stood at the fence in the dark and the cold, and Savannah worked through it, not out loud. She needed the quiet to think. And Luke seemed to understand that, because he didn't fill the silence with words, which was one of the few things she'd genuinely come to appreciate about him. "The correspondence files," she said finally. "I need 2 more days in them. If what I'm looking for is there, it fills the gaps." "What are you looking for?" "The instruction chain. Something that shows Holloway specifically directed the forgeries, not just that his company benefited from them. Right now we can prove fraud occurred and that Ridgeline Holdings received the proceeds. We can't yet prove Holloway ordered it. A good defense attorney argues Owen went rogue. Holloway was defrauded too, and the case against the firm collapses." Luke was quiet for a moment. "I have 1 letter," he said, "from Holloway to Owen directly. It's not explicit. It doesn't say forge these signatures, but it references specific parcels by acreage and coordinates and instructs Owen to ensure the transfers are completed by specific dates that match exactly when the forged transfers were executed. That's circumstantial, I know, but paired with what you found, paired with the specific language from the firm letter about handling documentation and the account trail for the payroll fraud and the timing." She stopped, breathed. "It might be enough. It's not as airtight as I want, but it might be enough for Rowan to issue an emergency injunction, which is what we actually need. We don't need a conviction in the next 4 days. We need a freeze on the remaining transfers before Holloway can complete them. Rowan can do that on a preponderance standard if the evidence package is organized to make the pattern undeniable," Luke said, "which is why the organization matters as much as the documentation itself." She looked at him. "I'll need you to bring me your complete file tonight, everything. I'm going to spend the next 2 days integrating your materials with what I've built from the records room and sequencing it so that when we put it in front of a judge, it reads as a single, unbroken chain. Not 2 separate investigations, 1 case." "All right," he said. "And the workers. Del Whitmore came to me this morning." "I know. You told him to." "I told him you were someone worth talking to. That's different from telling him what to do." "You're splitting a narrow hair. Maybe." He looked at the mountains. "But he's been owed that conversation with someone for 8 months. I couldn't be the one to have it. If Owen suspected I was anything other than a ranch hand, everything I've built this year goes up in smoke." She understood the logic. She didn't entirely forgive the logic, but she understood it. "The other workers," he named, "Martinez, Coles, the Perkins brothers. Are they trustworthy?" "With their own lives? Yes. With something this size?" He was honest about the uncertainty. "I don't know. People behave differently when they understand the actual stakes." "We're going to need them," she said. "Not now, but on the day we move. If we try to carry documentation out of here alone, 2 people with saddlebags full of papers moving toward the mountain trail is something Owen's riders will intercept before we're a mile clear. We need enough movement that we can't all be stopped at once." Luke turned and looked at her, and she could see, even in the darkness, that this was something he hadn't fully worked out yet. "You've been thinking about the exit strategy." "I've been thinking about the exit strategy since I heard Owen say whatever happens with her is on him." She kept her voice even. "I'm not interested in being the thing that happens, Luke. I've been on the losing end of this kind of operation once. I won't be again." I was quiet for a moment. "You won't," he said. Not a promise exactly, something closer to a statement of intention. She decided that was enough for now. They went back separately again. She counted the minutes between her leaving and his leaving and got back to the bunkhouse without seeing anyone, which was what she'd wanted. She was in the records room at 4 a.m. with Luke's complete file spread across the table beside her own materials, and she began to build the case. She had learned over years of dealing with fraudulent documentation, not entirely different from what a good portrait artist did. You didn't start with the details. You started with the overall composition, the structure that everything else hung on. The details mattered enormously, but only in relation to the structure. A devastating detail in the wrong sequence was just a confusing detail. The same devastating detail in the right position was the thing that made everything visible. She started with the railroad map. Not because it was legally the most important element, it wasn't, but because it established the motive with absolute clarity. Before a judge could care about the how, he needed to understand the why. And the why was in that map. Every forged signature, every ghost employee, every shell company registration made sense when you could see the railroad corridor and understand what controlling it was worth. She built from there. Motive, mechanism, documentation. She was 3 hours in when she found what she'd been looking for in the correspondence files. It was a letter, one she'd passed over earlier because it seemed like ordinary business correspondence from a property management firm. Routine language. Nothing that jumped out immediately. But she'd flagged it at the time because the date was unusual, 2 weeks before the third land transfer, and she'd come back to it now with Luke's file open beside her. The letter was from Holloway and Associates to Owen Mercer. It referenced, in the middle of an otherwise innocuous paragraph about filing procedures, the need to ensure that the managing member's authorization was secured for the upcoming property adjustments, with specific reference to parcels 14C and 14D. The exact parcel designations of the third land transfer. Managing member's authorization, not the managing member's actual authorization. The authorization, secured. In context, with everything else laid out around it, that language meant one thing. It was an instruction to produce a signature, by whatever means necessary, that would make the transfer look authorized. And it came from Holloway directly. She sat with it for a long moment. Then she added it to the sequence, in the exact right position, and kept building. By the time she was done, she had a documentation package that ran 47 pages when she counted the documents. Not 47 pages of narrative. She wasn't writing a report. 47 pages of actual documents, organized in a sequence that told the story of the fraud as clearly as a timeline and as legally as an evidentiary filing. Each document led to the next. Each gap that a defense attorney might try to exploit was closed by something in the following pages. Luke's letter about Holloway's direct instruction to Owen. The land transfer with the matching parcel designations. The forged signature alongside the original signature from a legitimate document showing the difference. The ghost employees. The account trail. The railroad map. She didn't know if it would be enough to convict Holloway at trial. That wasn't her job, and it wasn't the immediate goal. Her job was to make it impossible for anyone to look at this package and argue that nothing worth investigating had occurred. Her job was to make Judge Rowan issue an injunction before Holloway completed the final transfers and the land was gone forever. She thought she had done that job. She was reorganizing the final pages when the sound came, not from outside the window this time, from the hallway. Footsteps. More than one person. Moving with the specific urgency of people who were not trying to be quiet because they didn't think they needed to be. She moved. Not panicked, deliberate and fast. She put the documentation package back inside Luke's envelope, along with the copies she'd made of the key records room documents, pushed the envelope back under the floorboard, and had the board reseated in the floor before the door of the records room opened. Owen Mercer walked in. Behind him was a man she had never seen before, younger, dressed not in ranch clothes, but in the kind of clothing that said Capital City, said lawyer's office, said, "I am not from here and I am not apologizing for it." He had a flat, assessing expression that he directed at the room in general and then at Savannah specifically. Owen looked at the table where she'd been working. The documents she'd left out were the current year invoice files. Innocuous, legitimate, the kind of thing a records manager should be looking at. She'd made sure of that 3 seconds before the door opened. "Miss Mercer," Owen said, "working late again." "Or early, depending on perspective," she said. The man behind Owen said nothing. He was still looking at the room, looking at the filing cabinet, looking at the floor. The particular floor. She kept her breathing steady. "This is Mr. Crane," Owen said. "He's here to do a review of what you've been working on behalf of the ownership." "I thought you were the ownership representative," she said to Owen, keeping it direct, keeping it normal. "Mr. Crane handles certain administrative matters." She looked at Crane. He looked at her. "What have you covered so far?" he asked. His voice was professionally neutral in the way of people trained to extract information without revealing what they were hoping to hear. "Invoice reconciliation for the current fiscal year. I'm about halfway through the payroll register standardization I mentioned to Mr. Mercer at the start of the week. The land contracts are still waiting on the additional access I requested." "The land contracts are handled separately," Crane said. "You won't need to access those." "That was my understanding as well," she said, as if this confirmed something she'd already assumed rather than contradicting what she'd been told her job required. Crane looked at the filing cabinet again. "That cabinet, what's in it?" "Duplicates of the payroll registers, from what I can see, and some historical correspondence. I haven't processed it fully yet." She watched him decide whether to push further. He was calculating something. She could see it in the precise way he held still. He was deciding whether she was a threat or a complication or just a records manager doing records manager work. Too deep in invoice files to have found anything significant. She had spent 4 days in this room behaving like a records manager doing records manager work. She hoped it was sufficient. "We'll need a full inventory of every document you've handled," Crane said finally, "by tomorrow morning." "Of course," she said. "I'll have it ready." He nodded once, with the efficiency of someone checking a box, and left. Owen looked at her for a moment longer than Crane had. His look had a different quality to it, not calculating, exactly, more like a man trying to hear something in a silence that might or might not contain what he was afraid of. Then he left too. She waited 4 full minutes before she moved. Then she went to the loose board and pulled out the envelope. She pulled out the documentation package and looked at it. 47 pages, plus Luke's materials, plus the railroad map. Tomorrow morning. They had until tomorrow morning before Crane produced an inventory request that would make her work visible. And the moment her work was visible, the fraud she had documented was visible. And the moment the fraud was visible to the people committing it, the evidence would disappear, and so, quite possibly, would she. She needed to get to Luke. She needed to get to Luke right now. She left the records room and crossed the dark yard with the envelope tucked under her arm, inside her jacket, pressed flat against her side where it didn't show. The bunkhouse was quiet. She went past it, to the equipment barn, to the second stall post. She didn't need the board. Luke was there. He was standing in the dark of the barn just inside the door, and he'd clearly not been sleeping either. He looked at the envelope under her jacket. "Time to go," he said. "Yes," she said. "Right now." He was already moving. "I'll get the horses. Wake Martinez first. North bunkhouse, 3rd bunk. Tell him we need the mountain trail, and we need it before first light. He knows the route." "What about the others? Whitmore, Coles?" "Martinez will handle it. He knows what to do." He stopped and looked at her across the dark barn. "You have everything?" She pulled the envelope out and held it up. "Everything that matters." He nodded, in the specific economical way he had of nodding when he meant it completely. "Let's go." Outside, the mountain sat against the black sky, enormous and indifferent as it always was. But the trail was up there, and at the end of the trail was the Territorial Land Office, and a judge named Rowan, who, as Luke had said, the one consistent counter to Vincent Holloway's courthouse connections. They had 47 pages of documents and 3 days ahead of them, and the near certainty that Owen Mercer would notice they were gone before they were far enough clear. She tucked the envelope back under her jacket and followed Luke Ashford into the dark, toward the mountain, toward whatever came next. Martinez moved fast for a man who'd been asleep 20 minutes earlier. He didn't ask questions, which told Savannah that Luke had prepared him for exactly this kind of night. The kind where someone woke you in the dark and the only information you needed was direction and how fast. He dressed, pulled on his boots, and had 3 horses saddled before Luke finished gathering the saddlebags from the equipment locker. He was somewhere in his mid-50s, stocky across the chest, with the efficient movements of a man who had spent decades making decisions about what mattered and what didn't, and had gotten very good at the distinction. Savannah held the envelope inside her jacket with one arm while she helped with the second horse's cinch strap, because standing still made her feel like a target. "Whitmore knows to move the ledgers at first light," Luke said to Martinez, low and without looking up from the saddlebag buckle. "North storage room, the original payroll books from 2019 and 2020. He knows where." "He'll do it," Martinez said. "Eddie, too. If Owen moves before sunrise, then Dell stalls him." Martinez's voice was flat and certain, the voice of someone who had already run this possibility through his head and arrived at a conclusion. "Owen doesn't scare Dell anymore, hasn't for about a year since he figured out his pay was short." He looked up. "We've all known something was wrong. We just didn't know who to give it to." Savannah looked at him. "I'm sorry it took this long." He shrugged, in the way that wasn't dismissal, but was the gesture of someone who'd learned that apologies for things already done didn't change the things already done. "You're here now," he said. "Let's move." They went north and then east, away from the main road, threading through a back pasture gate that Martinez opened and closed behind them with the practiced silence of a man who'd done it in darkness before. The horses moved without lights. The mountain was above them, distinguishable from the sky only by the absence of stars where its mass blocked them. It was cold. Not brutally cold, not the kind of cold that stopped movement, but the mean, persistent kind that settled into your hands and the back of your neck and reminded you steadily that it was there. Savannah wore her coat and wished she'd brought a second layer and focused on staying even in the saddle, because thinking about the cold was less useful than thinking about the 47 pages pressed against her ribs. Martinez led them to the trailhead, showed Luke a specific rock formation that marked the turn that wasn't marked any other way, and then stopped. "You're not coming," Luke said. It wasn't a question. "Somebody needs to be here when Owen finds out you're gone," Martinez said. "Tell him you left in the night, don't know where. Might buy you a few hours." He looked at Luke steadily. "Been a long time since I worked for someone worth working for. Don't waste it." He turned his horse and went back down the hill without ceremony. Savannah watched him go, and there was something in the way he rode, deliberate, unhurried, a man returning to a place he knew would be difficult and going back anyway. That settled in her chest and stayed there. She and Luke turned to the mountain. The trail was the kind that people who didn't know mountains called a path. People who did know mountains called it a suggestion. It was narrow in places, genuinely absent in others, and required a specific attentiveness that meant you couldn't think about anything other than the next 20 feet of terrain in front of you, which was, in a way, useful. It stopped the part of Savannah's mind that kept cycling through everything that could go wrong and forced it into the immediate and physical. They rode without talking for the first hour. The mountain asked for concentration and got it. It was Luke who broke the silence when the trail widened briefly across a flat shelf of rock. "The hearing, when we get there." He was looking ahead, not at her. "Rowan's process, he'll want the documentation presented in order. He doesn't tolerate people telling him what the documents mean before he's read them himself." "Good," she said, "because the documents speak clearly enough without narration. His clerk's name is Hendricks. She controls access to his calendar, and she's protective of it. If we arrive without an appointment, we'll arrive with 47 pages of land fraud documentation and a Railroad Commission survey map. If Hendricks needs convincing, I can convince her." He was quiet for a moment. "You're not nervous." "I'm terrified," she said evenly. "I've just had a lot of practice not showing it." He looked at her then, briefly, the way he sometimes did when she said something that required a small recalibration of whatever working model he carried of who she was. Then he looked back at the trail. "When we get to the hearing," he said, "Holloway's lawyers will come after your credibility. They'll use your family's history, the fraud that took your family's ranch. They'll argue it makes you biased, personally motivated, that you're seeing fraud where there isn't any because you've been primed by your own experience to see it." "I know," she said. "How do you answer that?" She considered it, not because she didn't know the answer, she'd known the answer for a long time, but because she wanted to say it right, out here in the dark on a mountain, before she had to say it in a courthouse. I tell the truth, she said. Surviving fraud doesn't make me biased. It makes me qualified. There's a difference between being motivated and being wrong, and everything I found in that records room will still be true regardless of why I went looking for it. Luke was quiet for a moment. That's good. It's accurate, she corrected. Whether it's good depends on whether Rowan listens. They kept moving. The second hour of the trail brought them to a section where the mountain narrowed and the rock on either side rose in close enough that the horses had to go single file, and the sound of their movement changed, became more enclosed and somehow louder, each hoof placement precise and deliberate. Savannah concentrated on keeping her horse steady and not thinking about how exposed they were. She heard the other riders before she saw them. They kept moving at the same pace. Changing pace told whoever was behind them that they'd been heard. Keeping pace bought them 20 seconds of uncertainty, and 20 seconds was something. How far to the ridge crossing? She said, low and conversational, the way she'd say anything. 40 minutes. And once we're across? Different county jurisdiction. Owen's riders have no standing there, he paused. Assuming they're Owen's riders. They're somebody's riders, she said. They're not hikers. They came around a bend in the trail, and Luke pushed his horse slightly faster without it being obvious. And then they were on a wider section, and he moved alongside her and said, very quietly, there's a split in the trail in about 10 minutes. Main trail goes right. Left branch is steeper but shorter to the crossing, and it's not on any map that didn't come from someone who's worked this mountain a long time. How steep? Steep enough that they'll hesitate if they don't know it. He looked at her. You comfortable with that? She thought about the cold and the dark and the 47 pages. Which way do you go? Left? Then left, she said. The split appeared in the rock face like a decision point, which it was. The right branch was obvious, wider, more traveled, the kind of trail that looked like a trail. The left branch was a crack in the mountain's face, barely horse width, angling sharply up at a grade that made Savannah's horse flatten its ears in preemptive objection. She followed Luke left and they went up. Her horse managed it with the artless determination of an animal that trusted its feet more than it trusted the situation, and she let it, because interfering would have been worse than letting it work. The sound behind them continued for a moment, then stopped. She counted beats in her head. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then, distant and echoed, voices. Two of them, she thought, arguing about something. Probably the left branch. They kept climbing. By the time the trail leveled out onto the ridge itself, the voices behind them were gone. Either they'd taken the right branch and were now angling away, or they'd stopped entirely. She didn't know which, and couldn't afford to wait to find out. The ridge was open and the wind came across it hard and cold, and for the first time Savannah could see how far they'd come. The valley below was a collection of lights so small it was hard to believe Iron Crest Ranch was down there somewhere, that Owen Mercer was probably awake by now, and furious, that Crane had probably already sent a wire to Holloway. She looked at it for exactly 2 seconds, and then stopped looking, because it wasn't useful. 2 more hours to the county line, Luke said. After that, another 4 to Crestfall, where the land office is. 6 hours total. About. Then we ride, she said. They rode. The first light came about 2 hours later, the kind of gray early light that didn't commit to anything yet, just made the shapes of things visible without clarifying them. Savannah was cold in the way that had gone past uncomfortable into something she was simply managing, and her back had developed an opinion about the saddle that she was ignoring. She ate the hard biscuit Martinez had tucked into one of the saddlebags without tasting it, and drank water from the canteen that was cold enough to make her teeth ache. Luke was, as he generally was, not complaining about anything. This was either a genuinely useful quality or an extremely annoying one, and she hadn't decided which. They crossed the county line somewhere in the early gray hour when the light made everything look older than it was. There was no sign, no marker, just a dry creek bed that Luke said was the boundary, and they crossed it and kept moving. Tell me about Rowan, she said. Because they had time now and she needed the information. Appointed 7 years ago. Before that, he was a property attorney. He has a reputation for being thorough and very difficult to rush, which cuts both ways. He won't be pressured into ruling before he's ready, but he also won't be pressured into delaying when the case is clear. Has he ruled against Holloway before? Twice. Minor matters, comparatively. Contract disputes, nothing like this. But both times Holloway's lawyers tried to move the case to a different jurisdiction, and Rowan denied it. He doesn't like people trying to move things out of his court. Good, she said. We're not going anywhere. They reached Crestfall at mid-morning. It was a proper town, or close enough. A main street with actual buildings rather than just structures. A post office, a bank, 2 hotels, and at the far end of the commercial block, a building with the words Territorial Land Office cut in stone above the door with the permanent confidence of an institution that expected to still be there in 100 years. They tied the horses, and Savannah pulled the envelope from inside her jacket and straightened her coat and walked to the door. The clerk, Hendricks, which matched what Luke had said, was a woman in her 60s with the expression of someone who had been managing a judge's calendar for 20 years and had seen approximately every approach that people thought was original. She looked at Savannah. She looked at Luke. She looked at the envelope. Judge Rowan is in conference, she said. We need 15 minutes with him, Savannah said. We've ridden through the night from Ironcrest Ranch with documentation of an active land fraud affecting multiple properties in this territory. We have evidence that the destruction of records is being coordinated as we stand here. I'm asking for 15 minutes. Hendricks looked at her with the specific expression of someone recalibrating their initial assessment. What kind of documentation? The kind that requires an emergency transfer injunction. Savannah put the envelope on the desk. If Judge Rowan would prefer to have his clerk preview the package, that's his prerogative. But I'd recommend he see it himself because the pattern is something that needs to be understood as a whole. Hendricks looked at the envelope. Then she picked it up, not opening it, just holding it, as if weighing it. She stood. Wait here, she said. She went through a door at the back. Savannah and Luke stood in the anteroom. Luke was looking at the ceiling in the particular way of someone whose body was very tired and was deciding not to make that the main thing. Savannah was standing straight because sitting down would have made her feel like she was waiting for something that might not come. Hendricks came back after 6 minutes. He'll see you, she said. Judge Nathaniel Rowan was smaller than his reputation, which was usually true of people who had built their authority through competence rather than presence. He was maybe 65, thin, with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, and the envelope already open on his desk, the first page in his hand. Sit, he said, without looking up. They sat. He read in silence for a long time. Not skimming, reading, the way someone read who intended to understand what they were reading rather than form an impression of it. He turned pages at irregular intervals. He went back twice to earlier pages and reread sections before moving forward again. He said nothing. After 23 minutes, he set the final page down and looked at them. This is Luke Ashford, he said. It wasn't a question. Yes, sir. Rowan looked at him for a moment with an expression that was not quite judgment and not quite sympathy. Your signature appears on these transfer documents. On 2 of them, yes. Those 2 I signed under a fraudulent representation of what I was authorizing. I was told they were routine access easements for a water rights survey. The other 4 are forged. And you have evidence to distinguish which 2 were signed under misrepresentation and which 4 were fabricated. Luke reached into his jacket pocket and produced a small leather document case that Savannah hadn't known he was carrying. He opened it and placed 3 pages on the desk in front of Rowan, pages that had not been in her 47-page package. Comparison signatures across 12 authenticated documents over a 6-year period, plus a side-by-side of the disputed signatures with handwriting analysis notes from a document examiner I consulted in the Capitol 8 months ago. Savannah looked at the pages. You didn't tell me you had those. I was going to, he said. When? When we got here. Rowan looked between them with the precise neutrality of a man who had watched a great many partnerships function under stress. I take it you 2 are working together. More or less, Savannah said. And you are? Savannah Mercer. I was hired as the records manager for Ironcrest Ranch approximately 2 weeks ago. What I found in the records room forms the basis of this package. Rowan picked up one of Luke's signature comparison pages and looked at it. The handwriting examiner's credentials. Luke gave him a name. Rowan wrote it down. Miss Mercer. Rowan set the page down and looked at her. Walk me through the payroll fraud. Not the documents. I can read the documents. I want to hear how you found it and what you concluded from it, she told him. She was concise because Rowan struck her as a man who valued concision, and she was thorough because he also struck her as a man who would notice if she skipped something. She told him about the ghost employees, the account trail, the CR Management Services registration, the timing relative to the land transfers. She told him what the ghost payroll amounts represented in the context of Owen Mercer's total access to ranch finances. When she finished, Rowan said, "You have a personal history with land fraud." "Yes." "Your family's property." "Yes." He looked at her steadily. "Holloway's legal team is going to argue that history makes your findings unreliable, that you're predisposed to finding fraud because of what happened to your family." "I know," she said. "My answer to that is that the documents are the documents. My history determines why I was able to read them clearly. It doesn't alter what they say. The payroll totals are off by 43% across 4 years. The ghost employees appear in the wage register and nowhere else in the operational record. The notary stamps on 3 land transfers are from a county office with no jurisdiction in this territory. Those facts exist independent of who found them." Rowan held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded. Once, the way people nodded when something had been said that they intended to remember. He went back to reading. 40 minutes later, after he'd questioned them both on 7 specific points in the documentation and gone back to re-examine 4 pages he'd already read, he took off his glasses and set them on the desk. "I'm issuing an emergency injunction," he said, "effective immediately, freezing all pending property transfers involving Ironcrest Ranch LLC and any affiliated entities, including Ridgeline Consolidated Holdings. I'm also authorizing a preservation order for all documentation on the Ironcrest property." He looked at Luke. "That means if anyone destroys records after this order is issued, they're in contempt of this court, which is a different kind of problem than what they're facing now." Savannah felt something release in her chest that she hadn't fully realized she'd been holding. It wasn't relief exactly. Relief was for when things were finished. This wasn't finished. "Mr. Ashford," Rowan said, "I'm going to need your cooperation with the investigation that follows this injunction. That includes making yourself available, making the ranch accessible, and providing all documentation you've collected to my office." "Yes, sir. And I'm going to need to speak to the workers you mentioned, the ones with the payroll discrepancies." "We'll make that possible," Luke said. Rowan looked at both of them. "You rode through the night." "Yes, sir," Savannah said. "I'm going to assume that means you believe there's urgency." "Vincent Holloway was scheduled to arrive at Ironcrest Ranch today," she said. "Based on his pattern, arrival means final consolidation. If he finds the records gone and understands what we've done, his next move is to transfer whatever assets aren't yet frozen and establish a legal narrative that protects the transactions already completed." "Then we move quickly," Rowan said. He reached for his pen. "Hendricks will take your sworn statements this afternoon. I'm issuing the injunction order now. I'll have a marshal deputized and moving toward Ironcrest by this evening." He was already writing. "Vincent Holloway is going to have a very different day than he planned." He said it with the specific, arid satisfaction of a man who had been waiting for this particular category of case for a long time and was not going to waste it. Hendricks came in and they gave their statements one at a time, formally and on the record, in the plain language that sworn testimony required. Savannah had never given sworn testimony before and found that it was less different from what she did naturally than she'd expected. She told what she knew and stopped where her knowledge stopped and said clearly what was documented and what was inference and did not try to make the inference sound like documentation. When it was done and the paperwork was filed and the marshal was being briefed in an office down the hall, Savannah and Luke sat on a bench in the anteroom of the land office for the first time since they'd arrived. She had her hands in her lap. She was tired in the thorough way that went all the way to the center of things. "The hearing," Luke said, "when it comes to the full proceeding. Are you prepared for what they're going to say about your family?" "No," she said, "but I'll handle it." "That's not the same thing." "No," she said, "it's not." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the sounds of the town went on with the complete indifference of ordinary life to extraordinary things happening inside buildings. Horses passing, someone calling out to someone else, a door opening somewhere, banging in the wind. "I'm sorry," Luke said, "for how I brought you into this. I knew it wasn't right, and I did it anyway because the alternative was worse, and that's a calculation people make when they want to justify something they know is wrong." She looked at him. He was looking at the floor, which was not where he usually looked when he had something to say. It was the posture of someone saying something real rather than something strategic. "I know," she said. "I'm not going to pretend it doesn't matter. It does." She paused. "But what you built over that year, The documentation, the patience. You could have walked away. You had enough to protect your own legal position long before you had enough to protect everyone else. You stayed. He looked up. I'm not saying that makes everything square, she said. I'm saying it's part of the picture. He held her gaze for a moment, and there was something in his face that was tired and relieved and not quite at ease, all at the same time. The face of someone who had been carrying the weight of a year-long deception and was only beginning to understand what it felt like to set part of it down. Hendricks appeared in the doorway. The marshal is requesting your presence to review the approach to the ranch property, she said. Judge Rowan would like both of you available. They stood. Savannah straightened her coat, felt the envelope that was now, for the first time, no longer concealed against her body, but filed in the official custody of the Territorial Land Office. She felt lighter without it, and heavier at the same time. In the way of things that have been in your hand so long, you've stopped distinguishing between carrying them and being them. The door of the land office opened onto Crest Falls Main Street, and the hard morning light and the ordinary sounds of the world continuing, and she walked through it. Inside the marshal's office, 3 men with badges were looking at a map of the mountain trail and the Iron Crest Ranch property, and one of them looked up when she came in and said, "You're the one who documented this?" And she said, "Yes." And he nodded in the flat, impressed way of someone who respected competence primarily when it made his job easier, which was fine. She wasn't here for his admiration. She was here because 22 workers on one ranch and probably 60 more across the territory had been robbed of what they'd earned, and because 2,000 acres of land that had been built and worked and lived on by people who had given years of their lives to it was being transferred in pieces to a man who had never spent a day of honest labor on any of it. She was here because she had been 17 once, standing in an office, watching her father sign his name to a piece of paper that took everything away, and she had never once stopped being angry about it. She had just learned over the years to make the anger do something useful. The marshal said, "If Holloway is already at the ranch when we arrive," "Then we arrive," she said. "The injunction is issued. The preservation order is active. Whatever he's doing when we get there, he's already too late." The marshal looked at her for a moment. Then he looked back at the map. "All right then," he said. "Let's go through the approach." Outside, the mountain they'd crossed through the night was visible above the rooftops of Crestfall, enormous and indifferent as mountains always were. But on the other side of it was Iron Crest Ranch, and Martinez, and Del Whitmore, and Eddie Coles, and the Perkins brothers, and 22 people who were going to find out before this day was finished whether the fight that had been fought on their behalf while they slept was going to be enough. Savannah looked at the map and thought, it has to be. It was the same thought she'd had at 5 in the morning in the records room, sitting on the floor with documents spread around her. It was the same thought she'd had on the mountain trail in the dark, with the cold settling into her hands and the envelope pressed against her ribs. It was the only thought that had ever gotten her anywhere. She bent over the map and started pointing to the trail sections she knew. The marshal's name was Colton Briggs, and he had the unhurried confidence of a man who had served warrants on people who didn't want to be served for going on 22 years. He listened to Savannah's description of the trail sections without interrupting, asked 3 precise questions about the eastern approach to the ranch yard, and then organized his 2 deputies with the efficiency of someone who had done this kind of thing enough times that the logistics no longer required much thought. What required thought, he said, was timing. "If Holloway arrived this morning and he's already at the property," Briggs said, "then he knows something is wrong. The records manager and the man living as a ranch hand both gone in the night. That's not something you misread." "He'll be trying to move whatever he can before anyone arrives with papers," Luke said. "Which means we don't announce ourselves," Briggs said. "We go in on the eastern approach, which you tell me comes in behind the equipment barn. We serve the injunction on whoever is present, we secure the records room, and we take custody of anyone named in the order." He looked at Savannah. "Is there anything in that ranch yard that's going to make this difficult that I should know about before we ride?" She thought about Owen Mercer. She thought about the men Owen employed and the particular quality of loyalty that came from fear rather than respect. "Owen Mercer will not go quietly," she said. "He's been running this operation for years and he knows what the injunction means for him personally. The other ranch hands, most of them have no stake in protecting Owen, but there are 2 or 3 men who take their direction from him rather than from the ranch, and they'll follow his lead." Briggs nodded. "And Holloway himself?" "I've never met him," she said. "Luke?" Luke shook his head. "I know his methods. I don't know his temperament under direct pressure. His instinct in every situation I've documented has been to use lawyers rather than direct action. He solves problems through paperwork and legal maneuver, not confrontation. Then he'll try to argue, Briggs said. That's fine. People arguing at me don't shoot at me. He folded the map. We leave in 20 minutes. They rode back over the mountain by the lower route, which Briggs knew and which added an hour to the journey, but avoided the exposed ridge where anyone watching from the ranch could have seen them coming. It was past noon when the roofline of Ironcrest came into view below them, and Savannah felt the specific tightening quality of the moment that preceded things you couldn't take back. The eastern approach brought them in behind the equipment barn exactly as she'd described it, and they came through the gate at a pace that was purposeful without being theatrical, because Briggs was not a theatrical man. Owen Mercer saw them first. I was standing in the center of the yard, and whatever conversation he'd been having with the man beside him, a man in capital city clothes that Savannah recognized as Crane, stopped completely when he saw the marshal's badge catch the afternoon light. Something moved across Owen's face in a sequence she could track. Recognition, calculation, and then a settling into a particular kind of cold that was not panic, but was the thing that came just before panic, when someone decided panic was a luxury they couldn't afford. Owen Mercer, Briggs said, pulling up his horse and reaching into his jacket for the folded papers. I have an order from Judge Nathaniel Rowan of the Territorial Land Office. Emergency injunction freezing all property transfers associated with Ironcrest Ranch LLC and affiliated entities, and a preservation order for all documentation on this property. I also have a warrant for your arrest on charges of payroll fraud, falsification of legal documents, and conspiracy. The yard had gone completely still. Ranch hands who had been moving between the barn and the bunkhouse had stopped in place, and there was that particular quality of collective-held breath that a group of people produced when they were watching something happen that they had been waiting, without quite knowing it, to watch. Owen looked at the papers. He looked at Luke. Something in his face when he looked at Luke moved through a specific kind of rearrangement. The recognition of a man who had spent a year working beside someone without knowing what he was looking at. Ashford, he said, just the name, like confirming something. Owen, Luke said, you've been here a year. Yes. Owen was quiet for a moment. I should have known. Nobody works as hard as you did for ranch hand wages without a reason. He said it without apparent emotion, in the tone of a man filing a professional observation away for future reference, as if the situation were something that had happened to him rather than something he had built and maintained and profited from for years. Briggs dismounted and the deputies moved to either side of Owen with the practiced geometry of people who did this regularly. Owen did not resist. He stood with his hands at his sides and his jaw set, and he looked, in that moment, less like a man being arrested and more like a man who had made a series of decisions over a long period of time and had now arrived at their logical destination and was processing that arrival without the luxury of surprise. Crane tried to leave. He turned toward the main road with the decisive speed of someone who had calculated that no one was specifically watching him yet and that the window was narrow. One of Briggs's deputies was watching him. The deputy stepped in front of him and said his name and showed him the second warrant, and Crane stopped and looked at the paper with the expression of a man who had spent his entire career on the side of legal documents and was finding the experience of being on the receiving end of one considerably less comfortable than he'd imagined. Where's Holloway? Briggs asked. Crane said nothing. Vincent Holloway, Briggs said patiently, in the manner of a man who had learned that patience in these moments accomplished more than pressure. He was expected at this property today. Is he here? Savannah had been scanning the yard while Briggs dealt with Owen and Crane. She looked at the main house, the building she'd never been inside, the one that functioned as the owner's residence even when the owner had been living in the bunkhouse for a year. The curtain in the front window was pulled back at the edge, just enough for someone inside to see out without being visible. Main house, she said to Briggs, low. He followed her sight line and then nodded to his second deputy, who dismounted and walked to the main house door with the same unhurried authority Briggs himself projected. The deputy knocked. There was a long enough pause that Savannah thought for a moment that she'd been wrong about the curtain. Then the door opened. Vincent Holloway was shorter than she'd expected, which she knew was an irrelevant observation but made anyway. He was perhaps 60, well-dressed in the way of men who wore their clothing as a statement of position, and he had the kind of face that had probably been persuasive in rooms where persuasion ran on confidence and polish. He looked at the deputy, and then past him at the yard. At Owen in custody, at Crane with the warrant in his hand, at Luke Ashford standing in the center of the yard he nominally owned, at Briggs with his badge and his papers, and his 22 years of unhurried certainty. Holloway's face did not collapse. She gave him that. He had the self-control of someone who had survived difficult moments before by projecting calm, and he projected it now, even though she could see from where she stood that it was a performance rather than an actual state of being. "I'd like to speak to my attorney," he said. "You'll have that opportunity," Briggs said, "after I serve this warrant." Holloway looked at the warrant in the deputy's extended hand for a moment. Then he took it, because not taking it would not have changed what it said, and would have looked worse. He read it with the specific attention of a man for whom legal documents were a professional instrument, and she watched the moment when he reached the section that named Ridgeline Consolidated Holdings. The moment his eyes stopped moving for exactly 1 second before continuing. That 1-second pause was the only genuine response she got from him that afternoon, and it was enough. Del Whitmore appeared at the edge of the yard, coming from the direction of the north storage room, and he was carrying 2 large ledger books under each arm, which was 4 ledgers total, and he had the expression of a man who had been awake since before sunrise, waiting to be useful, and was relieved to finally be useful. He brought them to Savannah directly, because Luke had told him to bring them to Savannah, and she took them and held them, and felt the specific physical reality of them. The original payroll books, the pre-alteration records, the documented wages of 22 workers that represented the baseline against which everything else could be measured. "Anything else in there?" she asked Del. "2 more in the cabinet. Eddie's getting them." He looked at Owen Mercer in the deputy's custody and then looked away. "He's going to say we all knew," Del said. "Owen. He's going to say it was obvious and we all looked the other way." "He can say whatever he wants," Savannah said. "What matters is what the records say, and the records say you and the others were underpaid for years. You're the victims in this, Del, not the participants." He nodded, slowly, with the careful relief of someone accepting something they'd been afraid to believe until now. Briggs secured the records room within the hour. His deputies went through it methodically, while Savannah stood in the doorway and directed them to the specific files she'd identified and to the loose floorboard, which still held copies she'd made of the most critical documents, and to the filing cabinet with the land transfer folder. She watched Briggs's face as he went through the folder, the controlled, professional face of a marshal reading documents that confirmed something he'd been briefed on but was now seeing for himself. And she thought that this was what the last 2 weeks had been for. This moment. The documents in official hands, no longer subject to being handled appropriately by the people who needed them gone. It took the rest of the afternoon to complete the process at the ranch. Owen was transported to the county seat. Crane went with him. Holloway was permitted to accompany them in a separate conveyance with Briggs's second deputy, and he went with the dignified compliance of a man who had already begun constructing his legal response in his head and was conserving his energy for it. Savannah watched the vehicles leave the Iron Crest yard and felt the particular flatness that followed the end of an active crisis. Not disappointment, not relief, just the absence of the specific pressure that had been present for 2 weeks, and the slight disorientation of not having it there anymore. Luke came and stood beside her. He didn't say anything. He looked at the yard. His ranch, the ranch he'd spent a year of his life as a laborer on. The property his signature had been forged on 6 times by people who assumed he was too distant and too trusting to notice. He looked at it with the expression of someone seeing something familiar from an angle that had changed. "It's not over," she said. Because it wasn't. There would be hearings. There would be Holloway's legal team doing what legal teams did. There would be months of proceedings before the criminal charges reached any kind of resolution. "No," he agreed. "But the injunction holds, the transfers are frozen. Whatever happens in court, the land is here." That was true. That was the part that mattered most right now. The land was here, and it was frozen, and Holloway could not complete his corridor while a court order sat on every parcel he'd tried to acquire. She went back inside and began the process of making an inventory of everything Briggs's deputies had documented taking into custody, because someone needed to do it, and it was her job, and she was, at her core, a person who did her job. The public hearing before Judge Rowan was scheduled for 3 weeks after the day at the ranch, which gave the legal machinery time to assemble and gave Holloway's attorneys time to file the motions they were going to file and give the prosecution time to respond. Savannah spent most of those 3 weeks in Crestfall, working with the territorial attorney's office on the evidentiary sequence, making sure the 47-page package she'd built held up under the specific scrutiny of prosecution preparation. It mostly held up. There were 2 places where the attorneys wanted more documentation, and she went back to Ironcrest twice to find it, moving through the records room now with the full cooperation of the ranch, and without anyone trying to stop her, which was a different experience from the first time and a better one. Luke came with her on the second trip, and they worked side by side in the records room for 2 days straight, in the way that people who had been through something together sometimes worked, not particularly careful with each other, not particularly gentle, but with the ease of shared context, the shorthand of people who had established through difficult circumstances what they needed from one another. On the second evening, when it was too dark to work comfortably, and they'd covered most of what they'd come for, they sat on the front steps of the office building with coffee that was too bitter and too hot and not enough of either, and the mountains sat in the blue evening distance the way they always sat. "The Perkins brothers came to me yesterday," Luke said. "What did they want?" "To know if their jobs were safe, whether I was going to restructure the operation once the legal situation resolved." He turned the coffee cup in his hands. "Tom Perkins has been here 11 years. His father worked this ranch before him." "What did you tell him?" "I told him Ironcrest was not closing and his job was not going anywhere." He paused. "I also told him he was owed back wages with interest and that once the court ordered the calculation, he'd see it." She looked at him. "How did he respond to that?" He stood there for a minute and then he said thank you and walked away. Luke was quiet for a moment. "I don't think people say thank you to him very often. I think he didn't know what else to do with it." She understood that. She had said thank you to very few people in her life that she actually meant, and she remembered each time precisely. "You're going to have to figure out how to actually run this place," she said, "not as a ranch hand in disguise, as the owner." "I know. You're not going to be good at it initially." He looked at her, and the edge of his mouth moved. "Probably not. Martinez should be foreman. He's been doing most of the actual management work anyway, from what I can see, just without the title or the pay." "I was thinking the same thing." "Then tell him that instead of thinking it." She set down her coffee. "People can't act on what you keep in your head." He was quiet for a moment. "That's a comment on more than ranch management." "Yes," she said. "It is." The night had come down fully around them, and the lights of the ranch yard were the low, warm kind that made the darkness around them more present rather than less. She could hear the horses in the far pasture. She could hear Del Whitmore's voice somewhere near the bunkhouse, unhurried, talking to someone she couldn't see. "What are you going to do after the hearing?" Luke asked. She had been thinking about this. She'd been thinking about it the way she thought about most things. Not wishing, exactly, but mapping. Looking at the shape of what was ahead and trying to understand where she was in relation to it. "I have a job here," she said. "Records manager. The records room is a functional space now, and someone needs to keep it that way." He looked at her. "Don't make more of that than it is," she said. "The ranch needs someone who understands its financial history, which at this point I know better than anyone alive. It's a practical decision." "I know," he said. Not arguing, just confirming that he'd heard what she'd actually said and what she hadn't said, and that he wasn't going to push on the distinction right now. She appreciated that about him. She was beginning to appreciate several things about him, which was a separate situation that she was managing the same way she managed most things, carefully, and without performing it for anyone, including herself. The hearing began on a Tuesday morning in the Territorial Land Office's formal chamber, which was a room that had been built to convey the permanence of the institution occupying it. High ceilings, heavy wood, large windows that let in the kind of light that made you aware of your own size relative to the space. Judge Rowan sat at the front with the settled authority of a man on his own ground. The attorneys for both sides were arranged at their respective tables with the specific posture of people who had slept adequately, but not well. Holloway was present. He sat at the defense table in the composed stillness of a man who had arrived at this room with a plan, and the plan was written on his attorneys' faces. 3 of them, well-prepared, expensive, and visibly organized to do one specific thing: make Savannah Mercer the issue. She had known they would. Luke had told her. She had told Rowan. She had spent the last 3 weeks knowing exactly what was coming and making sure that when it came, she was ready for it. The prosecution's presentation took most of the morning. The territorial attorney walked Rowan through the documentation package in the sequence Savannah had established, and she sat at the prosecution's table and watched Rowan's face as each piece of evidence was placed before him. The payroll ledgers, the ghost employees, the land transfers, the Holloway firm correspondence, the Ridgeline registration documents, the railroad survey map. Rowan read everything himself rather than listening to it being described, which was exactly what she'd hoped for, because the documents were more persuasive than any narration of them. The worker testimony came after lunch. Del Whitmore first, then Martinez, then Eddie Coles, and both Perkins brothers. They sat in the witness chair and answered questions with the directness of people who had spent their working lives being straightforward because they didn't have the energy or the inclination to be anything else. They talked about their paychecks. They talked about taking their concerns to Owen Mercer. They talked about being told they were wrong. Tom Perkins, who was 43 and had worked at Ironcrest since he was 32, said very quietly when asked about bringing his wage concern to Owen. He told me I'd been miscounting, said I should be grateful I had a job at all. He paused. I went home that night and counted again. I hadn't miscounted. He paused again. I never brought it up to him again after that. The room was very quiet after Tom Perkins said that. Even the defense attorneys, who were professionals at making rooms feel a certain way, let it stay quiet for a moment, because the alternative would have looked worse than what it already looked like. The defense began its case in the mid-afternoon. The lead attorney was a man named Price, tall, precise in his movements, with the practiced confidence of someone who won a significant percentage of his cases and knew it. He spent his first hour on the documentary challenges. He argued that the payroll discrepancies were the result of record-keeping inconsistencies rather than fraud. He argued that the land transfers had been authorized under a power of attorney arrangement that Holloway's firm had been engaged to manage. He argued that the shell company structure was a legitimate tax and liability vehicle rather than a fraudulent concealment. I was good. Savannah watched him work and acknowledged to herself that he was good, because acknowledging an opponent's competence was the prerequisite for dealing with it effectively. Then he turned to her. Miss Mercer, Price said, addressing Rowan while directing the argument at her, which was a technique she recognized. The documentation at the center of this case was identified, organized, and sequenced by a single individual, Savannah Mercer, hired as a records manager at Ironcrest Ranch. Miss Mercer has no formal legal training, no formal forensic accounting credentials. What she does have is a deeply personal history with land fraud. He paused. Her family's property was acquired through a contested legal process 14 years ago. Miss Mercer has characterized that acquisition as fraud, though no criminal charges were ever successfully brought. It is the position of the defense that Ms. Mercer came to Ironcrest Ranch not as an objective records professional, but as someone primed by personal tragedy to find fraud where the evidence, examined objectively, does not support that conclusion. He said it well. He said it with the right amount of sympathy layered over the skepticism, so that it didn't sound like an attack but still functioned as one. She gave him credit for it. Rowan looked at her. Miss Mercer, you've heard the argument. Do you wish to respond? She stood. What Mr. Price has said about my family's history is accurate, she said. Our property was acquired through a process I believe was fraudulent, and I am not objective about that loss. I never claimed to be. She kept her hands at her sides, because the impulse to put them on the table or cross them said something she didn't want to say. What Mr. Price has not addressed is the substance of what the records show. He has argued that my motivation is suspect. He has not argued that R. Calloway existed. He has not explained why R. Calloway collected wages for 8 months and appears in no other operational record of the ranch. He has not explained why 5 people collected wages in total that represent 43% less than the stated hourly rates would produce. He has not explained why the notary on 3 land transfers operated exclusively in a county 300 miles from this territory. He has not explained why the receiving entity in 6 land transfers was registered to a legal clerk employed by his client's own firm. She stopped and looked at Price directly for the first time. My history explains why I knew how to find what I found. It does not change what I found. The documents I examined are the same documents that exist in the custody of this court. Judge Rowan can examine them independently of anything I have said about them, and they will say the same thing they said when I first read them. My childhood does not alter the numbers in the payroll ledgers. She sat down. Rowan's expression had not changed throughout, which was what she'd expected. He was not a man who performed reactions. He processed them internally and acted on them in his own time. Price attempted a response. He made several additional arguments over the following hour about the handwriting analysis, about the reliability of Luke's documentation given his concealed identity, about the interpretation of the Holloway firm correspondence. He was thorough and he was professional, and Savannah followed every argument with the specific attention of someone trying to identify the points where the prosecution needed to shore up its response. Most of the arguments failed to land because the documents were the documents, and the documents, as she'd told Price, did not change regardless of who read them or why. The one argument that gave her a moment's genuine concern was the power of attorney claim. The suggestion that Holloway's firm had legitimate authority to execute transfers on behalf of the managing member, which would explain Luke's signature on the first two documents without requiring forgery. Price produced a power of attorney document, dated 4 years earlier, that bore Luke's signature. Luke, on the stand, said he had never signed a power of attorney document for Holloway and Associates. He said his signature on the document Price produced did not match his actual signature, and he produced the handwriting analysis from the Capital City Examiner that he'd placed on Rowan's desk at their first meeting. Price said the handwriting analysis was from an examiner with a commercial rather than an academic credential. Rowan said he would weigh the analysis accordingly and that he was capable of doing so without assistance. Price said nothing further on that point. The hearing ran through a second day. Savannah testified formally, under oath, for 4 hours, 2 for the prosecution, 2 being questioned by Price, and she answered every question the same way she'd answered Rowan the first morning. She told what she knew, stopped where her knowledge stopped, distinguished between documentation and inference, and did not try to make either sound like the other. When Price returned for the third time to her family history, she said, "Mr. Price, I understand that this line of argument is your most available strategy. I would use it too, if I were in your position. But I want to point out that we have now spent more time discussing my 14-year-old family history than we have spent discussing 5 ghost employees, 6 fraudulent land transfers, and a shell company registered to your client's own legal clerk. If the defense's most compelling argument is about who I am rather than what the documents say, I think that's informative." Rowan looked like he was working very hard not to have an expression. Price moved on. At the end of the second day, Rowan said he would take the matter under advisement and issue his ruling within the week. This was, Savannah was told by the territorial attorney, fast for Rowan. He typically took longer. The attorney seemed to think this was a positive sign. She didn't allow herself to think it was a positive sign because the gap between a positive sign and an actual ruling was the space where things you'd counted on had a tendency to disappear. She spent the 5 days of Rowan's deliberation at Ironcrest, working. Not on anything related to the hearing. There was nothing left to do that was in her control, but on the actual records management job she'd been hired to do. She reorganized the records room into a system that any competent person could navigate without a guide. She set up a filing protocol for ongoing operations. She created a cross-reference index for the land holdings, the current legal ones, so that when the court resolved the fraudulent transfers, the documents demonstrating what belonged to Ironcrest and what had been illegally removed would be clear and complete. It was precise, methodical work, and she was good at it, and it calmed something in her that the hearing had stirred up. On the third evening, Martinez knocked on the records room door and told her that Luke had asked if she wanted to ride up to the north pasture where the fence work was being done. She said yes, because she needed to be outside, and because she'd been sitting with documents for 3 days and her back had developed the same opinion about the chair that it had developed about the saddle. They rode without particular destination, following the fence line north and then angling up toward the ridge where the land Holloway had tried to acquire spread out in the long amber of late afternoon. Up here you could see why someone would want it. Not because it was the most beautiful land she'd ever seen. It wasn't, especially. It was rough in the way high mountain land was rough. Not decorative, not managed into prettiness. It was the kind of land that asked something of you rather than offering itself. "My grandfather homesteaded about 60 miles from here," she said. Not because Luke had asked, but because they were up on the ridge and the moment had the quality of a moment that could hold something real. He filed the original claim, built the first structure, ran cattle for 20 years before my father took it over. My father ran it for another 15. And then it was taken. And then it was taken. She was looking at the far ridge. The man who did it? I knew him. He'd been to our house for dinner. He'd shaken my father's hand. He was persuasive in the way that Holloway is persuasive. He had a version of events that sounded reasonable if you didn't know what the documents actually said. But you knew. I was 17. I knew something was wrong, but I didn't know enough to stop it. She paused. I spent about 10 years being angry at myself for that, for being 17 and not knowing enough. It took me a while to understand that the problem with what happened to my family wasn't that my father was naive or that I was young. The problem was that someone decided to steal from us and had the tools to do it. Luke was quiet for a moment. And now you have the tools. I'm building them. She looked at him. That's different from having them. I found what I found here, and I organized it well enough that Rowan couldn't ignore it. But there were gaps. There were things I couldn't prove as cleanly as I wanted. I got lucky in a couple of places. That letter from Price's office about handling documentation, that was exactly the kind of explicit instruction that usually gets buried before anyone finds it. That was luck. It was luck you found it, he said. It was skill that you knew what it meant. She considered that. It was a fair distinction. I want to do this again, she said. Not just here. There are other ranches Holloway was working, other families. Someone needs to go through their records the same way. He looked at her. That's not a records manager job. No, she said. It's not. It's something closer to what you described doing here. Document forensics, land fraud investigation. Someone with a formal credential would call it that, yes. Would you want a formal credential? She thought about it. Not particularly, but I'd want the access that comes with one. The ability to walk into a records room and have the authority to actually compel documentation rather than having to break into filing cabinets with letter openers. The edge of his mouth moved. That was impressive, by the way. 90 seconds, she said. My father taught me. He said a ranch woman who couldn't open a stuck lock was a ranch woman waiting on someone else to solve her problems. He sounds like he was practical. He was. She looked at the mountains. He was also too trusting, which is where I'm different from him. I don't assume people are honest until they prove otherwise. I wait for the documents. That sounds lonely, Luke said. Not unkindly. She was quiet for a moment. Sometimes, she said. But it also means when I trust something, it's because the evidence is there, not just the feeling. He held her gaze for a moment and then looked back at the ridge, and she understood that he was filing that statement in the same place she filed things when they were important and she wasn't ready to act on them yet. That was fine. She was patient with evidence. Rowan's ruling came on the 6th day, delivered in a written order that the territorial attorney brought to Ironcrest in person, because he said some documents deserved to be delivered rather than sent. Savannah read it at the table in the records room, the room she'd stood in for the first time 2 weeks into what felt like a different chapter of her life entirely. She read it carefully and completely before she said anything. The ruling found that the preponderance of evidence supported the conclusion that a systematic fraud had been perpetrated against the ownership and workers of Ironcrest Ranch and associated properties. All 6 land transfers to Ridgeline Consolidated Holdings were voided. The properties were restored to Ironcrest Ranch LLC with full legal title. A restitution order required the calculation and payment of all underpaid wages with interest. Owen Mercer was remanded for criminal trial on charges of payroll fraud and conspiracy. Vincent Holloway was bound over for criminal trial on charges of conspiracy, document fraud, and wire fraud. Crane was referred for professional misconduct proceedings. The emergency injunction was made permanent pending the criminal proceedings. It was 41 pages, the ruling. She read all 41. Then she set it down on the table and sat there for a minute. Del Whitmore found her there when he came to ask if she needed anything from the main kitchen. He looked at the document on the table and then at her face, and he was smart enough to read the situation without needing it explained. Good news? He said. Good news, she said. He nodded slowly. Then he sat down across from her, which was not something he usually did. Del Whitmore was a man who stood in doorways rather than taking chairs. He was quiet for a moment. My father worked a ranch 3 valleys over, he said. Lost it. Not the same way you folks at Ironcrest, different people, different situation, but the same shape of thing. Someone with better lawyers than us saw something worth taking and took it. He looked at the table. I always thought that was just how things went. People like that, they have the tools and we don't. They have tools, she said. They don't always have the documents. He looked at her. Is that what you do? Go where the documents are? She thought about what she'd said to Luke on the ridge. About doing this again. About other ranches, other families. I think so, she said. Yes. He nodded. Well, he said, and stood up. I hope you don't stop. He went back to the kitchen. Savannah sat alone in the records room that had become, over the weeks she'd spent in it, something close to a home, or at least the closest thing to a home she'd allowed herself in a long time. The filing system was organized, the indexing was clear, the fraud was documented, ruled upon, and in the hands of the courts. The room smelled like paper and lantern oil, and the particular dry dust of old documents that had finally been put in order. She found Luke at the north fence that afternoon, which was where she'd found him the first time, repairing a post with the same calm precision she'd noticed that first morning. He didn't look up when she approached, which meant he'd heard her coming and had decided that looking up could wait. Ruling came, she said. He set down the hammer. And? Everything we asked for. Transfers voided, back wages ordered, Owen and Holloway bound for criminal trial. I was quiet for a moment. She watched something move through him. Not the dramatic version of relief that stories told, the kind with exhaled breath and visible release. Something quieter and more complicated. The expression of a man who had spent a year of his life on something and was only now beginning to believe it was finished. The workers, he said. The back wages. When does that get calculated? Court will appoint an auditor, probably 30 to 60 days before the numbers are final, then payment order follows. Could be another few months before checks are actually cut. She looked at him. It's not fast, but it's real. He picked up the hammer again and looked at the fence post. Martinez is going to need to hire 3 more hands to replace the ones Owen had on his private payroll. People who actually do the work they're paid for. Then hire them. I'm not sure I know how to do this part, he said. The regular part. After all of this, she understood what he meant. The regular part was harder than the crisis part in certain ways. The crisis had a shape and a direction and a clear measure of success or failure. The regular part was just ongoing, which required a different kind of stamina. You do it the same way you did everything else, she said, one fence post at a time. He looked at her, and then he actually smiled. Not the edge-of-the-mouth version she'd been getting for weeks, but an actual smile, which changed his face considerably and made him look younger and less like someone carrying 3 years of accumulated weight, which he was, but which he was also, for this particular moment, setting down. She didn't smile back quite, but she didn't look away either. I'm staying through the winter, she said. The records need the ongoing work and I'm the best person for it. After that, I don't know. After that, he said, maybe see what other records rooms need someone who knows what they're doing. Maybe, she said. They stood at the fence for a moment, in the ordinary way of people who have been through something together and have arrived, without entirely planning to, at a place that is more than the sum of the journey that brought them here. The ranch worked around them. Eddie Coles crossed the far yard carrying something she couldn't identify from this distance. Tom Perkins was visible near the equipment barn, doing what Tom Perkins was always doing, which was whatever needed to be done. The horses were in the north pasture, exactly as they should be. The mountains were where they'd always been. Iron Crest Ranch was not a perfect place. It had bad fencing in the eastern section and an equipment barn that needed a new roof before spring and a bunkhouse with a heating system that was more aspiration than function. The records room would need monthly maintenance to stay functional, and there would always be more paperwork than hours in the day to deal with it. And the criminal trials for Owen and Holloway would drag through the courts for the better part of 2 years and require testimony and retestimony and the grinding, inglorious work of justice that looked nothing like justice did in the stories people told about it. None of that was going to be clean or simple or finished. But the land was here. The transfers were voided. The workers were going to be paid what they were owed. The documents were in order. And the people who had tried to take this place apart piece by piece for the benefit of a man who had never once turned honest soil were going to stand in front of a judge and be held to account for what they'd done. That was enough. It was not everything, but it was enough. And Savannah Mercer had learned the hard way that enough, real, documented, legally binding enough, was not a small thing. It was, in fact, the only thing that lasted. She turned from the fence and walked back toward the records room, because there was still work to do, and she was someone who did her work, and the afternoon was not yet over, and there was a filing system that needed her attention, and a ranch full of people whose futures were safer today than they had been yesterday, and that was not nothing. That was, in the end, everything she had come here looking